The guy goes and washes his face, and he comes up, and suddenly, for the first time in his life, he can see. He can see. This doesn't make any sense. And so the guy goes home to his family and his friends, to the people he lived around and who he used to beg in front of. And he goes and it says this: his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging, asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" No. Oh, some claimed that he was. Others said, no, it just looks like him. I mean, so here we have the first breakdown of the unexplainable and the undeniable. You have a group that looks at this and says, wait a second, that is not possible, that a guy who was begging his whole life, who couldn't see, could come home seeing. It's not possible that that's him. And then there's some other people saying, I don't know, it really looks like him though. Hey, I think that is him. And so he comes along and says, and insists, but he himself insisted, I am the man. It is undeniable. I'm the guy who was blind, but now I can see. How then were your eyes open? They demanded. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see. And I could just see him sitting there going, no, that's not possible. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. So they follow it up because they want an explanation. So they said, all right, where is this man? They asked him. I don't know, he said. I didn't see where he went. All right, now that's my paraphrase, but I think you got to read that in there. The guy's like, I couldn't see. Don't forget that. That was my reality forever. They brought to the Pharisees the man who was born blind. In other words, they couldn't solve this problem. So they went to the smartest, most religious people they knew to get the answers that they were seeking, because they'd run across something undeniable but also unexplainable. So they went to the guys who typically had the explanation. So they took him to the Pharisees. That's why they went to the Pharisees. Now, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. This is going to present a problem, because Jews were not supposed to work on the Sabbath. God doesn't even work on the Sabbath. This is another problem. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. So the man says, he put mud on my eyes, and I washed. Now I see. End of story. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. And here we have it. The Pharisees have this box that God fits in. And that box says God doesn't do anything on the Sabbath, and we're not allowed to do anything on the Sabbath. So if Jesus is supposedly the guy who heals them on the Sabbath, that doesn't fit, because God doesn't do that kind of thing. And so they have this nice little box, and if God doesn't fit in this box, it must not be God. Don't we all have a box like that? I bet you do. Check your prayers, because your prayers are dealing with the God that's inside your box, and you want God to work this way and do this thing because that's what God does. And then there are those of you who aren't believers because God doesn't fit in your box, because God wouldn't do this. God wouldn't allow that. And if there was a God, clearly this wouldn't happen. So there must not be a God, because God doesn't fit in this box. See, all of us carry boxes. Well, the Pharisees had this box about God, and this miracle wasn't fitting in it. It just wasn't fitting. But others asked, how can a sinner do such miraculous signs? And so they were divided. And here we have it again, unexplainable and undeniable. They were looking at it saying, this guy can see, and he says that Jesus made him see, but Jesus did it on the Sabbath. God wouldn't do that on the Sabbath, so it couldn't be God, but who can heal but God? This is creating a problem. This is unexplainable in the face of the undeniable. How are we going to deal with this? There were a group who sided with the undeniable side of it. Finally, they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. You know, this is kind of like they're playing, are you smarter than a Pharisee? All right, tell me about this. Explain this to me. Tell us in a way that fits inside our God box, because right now your explanation doesn't. The man replied, "He's a prophet." The Jews still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. See, what happens is when we get stuck on the unexplainable, that's where we stay. And if nothing fits inside the box that we've created for God, suddenly it's not acceptable. And we begin to discount it. And so what do they begin to do? They begin to say, no, that's not possible. It's not possible that this guy was born blind. Let's get his parents because they'll prove whether or not he was born blind, because that's just not possible. That he must have been tricking. He must have been kind of, he could see, but he was acting like he couldn't. And so they're pretty sure that this guy was pulling one over on them because they refused to accept anything that didn't fit in their God box. But you see, God often works outside of the box we create for him. And he does things that catch us by surprise. And he's challenging us to pry open that box a little bit and allow him to be who he really is. You see, there's a lot of people who will discount the changes in the things that they see. I see it all the time with people who come to faith in Christ, and suddenly their lives are transformed, and they begin to change. And people say, "What's up with you?" They say, "Well, God did it." And they say, No, God doesn't do that kind of thing. God doesn't make that kind of change. God doesn't take somebody like the story of Amy and in a moment deliver her from depression. God doesn't do that. There are people who say that is absolutely not possible. I was talking to her this past week, and she said that she went to a doctor, and he kind of going through the list of prescriptions, and she used to deal with depression, and God delivered her from it. And so she's no longer on the antidepressant drugs. And the doctor looked at that, and he said, "How come you're not taking these anymore?" She said, "Well, God healed me of it." So he said, "All right, well, if you ever need these filled again, just let me know." Because to him, it doesn't fit that God would do that. Now, there are some of you who suffer from depression. You know what? And maybe the medication is your healing. Maybe that's what God has provided for you. But you'll hear of somebody being delivered from depression, and suddenly the God box that you have, it's like, wait a second, God, if you're going to do it for them, why aren't you doing it for me? And sometimes the healing and the blessing that he provides somebody else is suddenly one of your obstacles because you want it for you. And it's like, it's one of those challenges that we face that, God can't win one way or the other because all of a sudden it creates an obstacle for us. It creates an unexplainable category. But in this case, this man had received his sight. And people were trying to deny it. And so they called his parents and said, "Listen, tell us this isn't true." They asked, "Is this your son? Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see? Explain this to us." And this is what the parents say. "We know he is our son. And we know he was born blind. But how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He'll speak for himself." And there's a reason that they gave the answer that they gave. You'll find it in the next verse. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." They didn't want any part of this. They're like, don't get us involved in this. Ask him. He's an adult. He can handle it himself. Yes, he's our son. Yes, he was born blind. Everything else, leave it up to him. What's interesting about this is this is the way it works. For those of us in this room that were maybe raised in a Jewish household, the Jesus option was not an option. These guys had already decided that if Jesus is the answer, that's not the answer we're looking for. So don't give us that answer. There are some of you that were raised in the homes where maybe religion was seen as a crutch or a weakness, or belief in God was considered foolish and disregarded. And you grew up with that skepticism about God. And there's a lot that's unexplainable. And because of those categories of it not being understood and being kind of an obstacle and a doubt, you're just kind of stuck there because you've already predetermined, if God's the answer, I don't want to hear the question.